board. What else did you want to ask?
Yeah, I had a few questions, just probably for clarification for myself. Sure. The first one being, there was a point where you and Father Fred were going back and forth about novellas and court tales and which, it was. Uh-huh. And the reason I ask is because when Father Fred mentioned court tales, it made me think of 16th and 17th century Italian masques. Well, I suppose they started in the UK, but then moved over to Italy. And I was wondering if that was what he was referring to regarding the court tales, or if he was referring to something else.
Well, we had this conversation again this afternoon, so I'm going to let him tell you some things about this, and then I will fill in where I said, and yes, and that's just like, so anyway, yours.
Okay, yeah. I think part of what I was trying to get at, Ashley, was that actually the tales that are told in the book of Daniel actually have sort of rough chronological equivalents elsewhere in the day. So the kinds of court tales I'm talking about actually predate the medieval court tales. So I wasn't getting at medieval categories of royal courts at all. I was really talking about the kind of thing that you see in the book of Tobit, the kind of thing you see that kind of happens in Esther.
Definitely in Esther.
Definitely
kind of in Judith.
Esther. Kind of in Judith. So it's very different than the medieval court tales. And when I offered that up as an alternative to novella, I wasn't trying to suggest that novella might not help you visualize what's going on in Daniel. But I think you have to remember that novels and novellas are a more recent literary genre. So I was just trying to kind of get at the historical issue there. It's not a bad way of imagining it. It's just that if you do use that to help you understand what's going on in Daniel, you do still have to bear in mind that it's not a category that people in Daniel's day and age would have used.
Yeah, there's court tales is a term of art in biblical criticism, and it's always and it's true across the ancient Near East. I mean, this is a very ancient way for human beings to tell stories, but it's it always involves the prince or the princess or the almighty king, and then the protagonist of the story, who was almost never the almighty king, and those kinds of sort of tropes that happen. French fairy tales are, like Cinderella, are quintessentially court tales. They aren't biblical, but they always happen with a king and a prince or a would-be princess, or all of those. Esther is that way. And these were stories that were lodged both, and we'll talk about this with Daniel tonight, the historicity of the story at one level wasn't nearly as important as the story itself.
And the point the story
and
made.
The point the story made.
Yeah.
Okay, so our problem is, unless we call it a novel and it looks something like War and Peace, or you name it, whatever other novel you want to think of, in it, and it's bound in a big thick book, we think it needs to be historical and or literal. And that doesn't work at all in the conception of Daniel. It's just like, and I don't know, this is what I read about Cinderella. I didn't do a lot of literary criticism on fairy tales, but in the days of the days when Cinderella became a story that was frequently told, it was frequently told in the context that almost every child had a stepmother, because the odds of dying at any given birth for a woman are 1 in 5. Were 1 in 5, and that was true until the middle of the 20th century. And so, if the chance was that if your mother didn't die with you, there's still a very good chance she would die with a subsequent sibling, and your father would remarry, because less than something like 30% of children live to their 5th birthday. So infant and child and mother mortality was a huge hole in the culture. And so men remarried multiple times to have a family. Well, Cinderella is the quintessential story about a stepmother relationship gone wrong. Okay. Hansel and Gretel is another one. Okay, so those stories are stories that help, like the stories of Greek myth, they talk about truths that are too deep to handle didactically. They're too important for you to be able to talk about them in straightforward language. So you come at them through a story that engages people emotionally as well as intellectually, and then they can then they can relate to the story, and they can get the truth out of it without feeling assaulted by it.
And that's not to say that Scripture doesn't rely upon history or rely upon fact. The stories told about Jesus and the inferences made about Jesus and Jesus's resurrection depend upon their historicity, ultimately. But it's
but gospel and Daniel are not the same genre of literature at all.
Yeah,
nor were they intended to be.
Yeah, not the same genre, not making the same kind of case.
Can I ask you a quick question, Natalie? This is Chrissy or Fred. So if I'm understanding what you've been saying this week and last week, and I appreciated Sharon asking that question because I had the same thought. The Daniel interpretation book says that he is a non-historical person, and what you're saying is this, that Daniel is not a prophet writing firsthand of his visions.
No, we'll talk about that a little bit more this evening, but no, that's one of the differences between Daniel and the book of Revelation. Christian interpretation tended to want to see Daniel that way, and we'll talk about that a little bit tonight, Chrissy, I hope. Okay. But all of chapters 2 through 7, those 6 stories, they were all probably stories that were independent. And we'll talk about the difference in style tonight between 2 and 3.
Okay. My study Bible has a lot of information on that, like in the chapter preface. But it also says that Daniel was a 6th century prophet writing firsthand accounts of visions. So I guess there's a difference of scholarly approach on whether that.
Well, there's a lot of investment in certain parts of the Christian tradition in Daniel having written firsthand. But here's the deal. Nebuchadnezzar lived in the 6th century before Christ. Daniel, we know, appears in its present form in a literary form in sometime in the 2nd century before Christ. So 400 years or so later. Around 160. So Daniel can't be writing in the first person about...
And I see that noted down there, which is why I was so confused. So I just wanted to get a real definitive answer on that so that I don't teach incorrectly.
Yeah, the preponderance of the evidence is that Daniel is not literally writing his own story, just as Moses didn't write the Torah or the account of his own death and funeral. But especially in those places in the Christian tradition where it's really important for these books to be literally true, then they're going to want to insist upon that. And that insistence may or may not, and often does not, bear any resemblance to the historicity of the books as we know it. So does that help?
It does help. Let me just ask a follow-up question.
Sure.
Do you feel like any of the visions are divinely inspired to be included in the Bible?
In this particular book, I think the point is God does send us visions. And we'll talk about that some tonight too. I think, for example, in Revelation, we have a little bit different problem to deal with there in terms of John's reception of his visions and the way that he records them. But I do think that in this particular case, the point is that God sends the dreams and their interpretations. And that God can and will do that. And we'll talk about that here in a little bit. So Ashley, did we answer your question before we go on?
Yeah, you answered one of three.
There
Oh,
you go.
okay.
But Paul has the question, and I want other people to have turns. I don't want to bogart.
All right.
But isn't it, maybe Fred, we talked about this earlier, isn't this the audience to whom these were written at the time? I mean, they weren't looking for historicity. The way they looked at these stories really were about the point, the message, and they're less about was this guy actually around at the time of Nebuchadnezzar? Am I correct?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, Paul. I mean, these are stories told in roughly about 167 BC about events that happened well before that as a window into what's happening in 167. So if effectively what the writer is saying, and you notice the writer doesn't present himself as being Daniel. The writer talks in the third person about Daniel. And in the visions, he uses the first person singular, but only after he introduces Daniel in the third person. So what the writer is doing is the writer is drawing on these stories from the past as a window into how to live now. It doesn't, the truth of the stories, the truth of the visions doesn't hinge on Daniel being a historical figure. Now, I mean, if someone discovered that Daniel was a historical figure and these were stories that had been circulating for centuries, and it turned out that there was a historical Daniel, that wouldn't particularly distress me. It just doesn't, the truth of the stories just doesn't depend upon that any more than, as I said maybe last week, that the truth of the parable of the prodigal son rises and falls on whether or not there was a prodigal son. I mean, the truth of the story draws you into it. And what's really interesting about the way it's told is that, most people really are struck by the power of that story, figuring out whether or not they're a prodigal or the son who stayed home.
So think about, I'm trying to think who it would be. For those of us who were born before 1989, the universal bad guy was the Russians, okay? Right. And everything bad in the world that happened could be, all the movies were about Russian bad guys, right? And Nebuchadnezzar becomes, in the Jewish imagination, he becomes the universal bad guy. So anything you want to set in a time when Jews are being persecuted, when they've been held captive, when the king is doing this over them, it's very easy to set it in the time of Nebuchadnezzar. Judith and Esther, Tobit, all of those stories were written after, or in and around the time of Daniel. Most of them written a little bit before, but all of them use Nebuchadnezzar or a Persian king as a bad guy. And that's because those were the looming empires. And so you want to find your universal bad guy that everybody can go, ooh, you know. Later, when John writes Revelation, it's Rome. Right. And so Rome becomes Babylon. So
what if as Americans, if we said, we don't want a monarch, who are Americans typically talking about?
King George.
King George.
Right. Thanks,
right. King George is the classic monarch in American mythology. And I don't mean the word mythology in a negative way. I mean mythos as in kind of, he's the type of a monarch. And that conveys certain truths. And I think our problem is, our problem really isn't the Bible. Our problem is us. We've bought into the idea that the only truths worth knowing are factual truths. I was telling Paul earlier today that I used to drive my students crazy because when I tried to teach them things about Scripture, like the conversation we're having about Daniel, they'd say, well, but if Daniel didn't exist, then this isn't true. And I'd say, wait a minute, not all truths that we live by, and in fact, most of the truths that really matter to us are not things you can prove. I'd ask them, do your parents love you? And they'd say, well, sure they do. And I'd say, well, prove it. And they said, well, they provided me with a home and they fed me. I said, of course they did. They know they're going to get old and feeble.
And they could go to jail if they didn't.
And they could go to jail if they didn't. So they're trying to make sure that you're going to care for them when they're old and feeble. And they'd say, yeah, but they sent me to college. And I'd say, of course they did. They don't want you to do a sloppy job of it. They don't want you to try to take care of them in their old age with a $15 an hour job at McDonald's. They want you to have a real job with an income and benefits and, and pay raises and all the rest of it. And just short of the time that they started to go to the dean to complain about me, I'd say, look, I'm not trying to tell you that your parents don't love you. I am telling you that it's a truth you live by, but you can't stuff it in a test tube.
Natalie can testify. I did use that analogy at the youth group session earlier, but I didn't go. It wasn't quite as harsh. I do want those kids to come next week. I didn't tell them your parents only want you around so you can take care of them.
Yeah. There you go, Paul, which is why my students ended up going to the dean and yours wouldn't have.
Well, we haven't seen it. Only half an hour ago. So.
You haven't seen my email yet for tomorrow.
I know. Who knows?
So, any other questions?
Yeah, I just kind of wanted to jump on the back of that. Just because using a familiar shape of a story is a storytelling technique that has gone on for millennia. Because you use familiar aspects of story to help convey a particular meaning. And just because, think of Aesop's fables, think of any of the different fictional stories that have been used to teach different morals or teach different truths using fictional characters. Just because the narrative itself may not have necessarily happened, does not mean the truth and the lessons taught therein are any less valid. It just means that the medium to which they were told might just have been a familiar shape to the people that it was originally intended to be sent to, and therefore they would be more receptive to it.
Sure.
Right. Yeah.
Absolutely. So, Ashley, you had two more. Are they quick ones?
Well, sure. I'll just skip the one because I could probably, Google's free, and I'll go to the third one. So towards the end of last week's session, the identity of, or the idea of identity and the communication of religious identity came up, and we were specifically talking about Jewish identity. Though it sounded like the subtext of the conversation was sort of circling the drain around Christian identity. And I was curious, and this was probably covered in the Paul class you guys had last semester, but I was curious how we tie that to or apply that to 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 19 through 22, the whole, to Jews I became a Jew, to the weak I became weak, et cetera, in order that they would know the gospel, et cetera. So how, I guess I'm asking questions about identity performance and how we understand that better with regard to being faithful in public. Does that make sense? Or is that like...
Oh yeah, that makes sense. You know, it's a term paper.
You're welcome.
And I think goes a little deeper than I had intended last week. I mean, what Daniel is talking about is this was put together for a group of Jews who were living under the oppression of a Greek overlord who had desecrated the temple. And so in a sense destroyed everything that was important to them. And so this was about how you're faithful in the midst of that world. And so when early Christian interpreters started reading Daniel, that's certainly how they saw it, especially those in the earliest parts of the church when the church was oppressed or suppressed. And so that was always the question, how do we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? How are we faithful when we're not connected to all the things that we hold dear? I think Paul is actually talking about something else.
Okay, cool. I've heard them misappropriated, so I wanted to make sure I was clear on what we were talking about.
I think that Paul's issue is a whole different issue, and yeah, we spent half a class on it last term, so it's a biggie, but it's not this. I don't think it's the same issue. What are you going to say?
Yeah. Well, what I was going to say was, though, here's a question worth entertaining throughout our conversation about Daniel and Revelation, and it does go to the question of Christian identity, and that is okay. Daniel and Revelation, I think, is fair to say, were both written to the faithful. The Jewish faithful in the case of Daniel, the Christian faithful in the case of the book of Revelation. Both of them, though, tied to the God of both books in one way or another. And they're trying to sort out the question in a world that's hostile to how they understand God. Here's the question for us. How do we remain faithful in a culture that in some ways is really genuinely hostile to what we believe, but is also a culture in which maybe we're all together too comfortable? And too prone to make peace with easily.
That's
just something to think about. I don't want to, I'm not sure how much further I want to go with that at the moment, but I think it's one of the really tough questions that both Daniel and Revelation raise.
Well, and in all of the biblical court tales, Esther, Tobit, Judith, Daniel, this first part of Daniel especially, where these separate stories come together. Joseph from Genesis, all of those stories, the person who's the hero in the story has a tremendous amount to lose. Not just their life, but all of their standing, all of their acceptance into a foreign culture, all of their everything, to borrow a phrase that Fred uses in the context of what Jesus wants from you. But they have all of that to lose. And so the story is always about the exceptional risk of choosing God over costing yourself everything. Okay, we saw that last week in the first story, though it wasn't as explicit. It's a lot more explicit in the story tonight and in the story in chapter 3. So
great segue.
I'm going to use that as a segue, and we're going to start there. I wanted to show you, and then I'll share my screen. Oh, that's the wrong one. Tonight, and not because I expect you to have it,
because it's expensive.
Because it's very expensive. I'm using and I don't know if you can read or see any of that, because I can't. It's impossible. Yeah. I'm using a translation of Daniel that was done by a guy named Robert Alter. He translated.
In the chat.
Yeah, he translated the entire Old Testament, and the book came out Christmas before last. And it's got a fabulous commentary in it. And just is really helpful. So, and I think the translation is a little bit clearer than the New American Bible, which is my standard reference Bible, or the NRSV, which I know a lot of you have. I'm not sure that their translations of either one are really compelling translations of the text. So I'll
get a link.
Fred will put a link up for it. But I want to start with chapter 2, and we'll go from there. And you can just be intrigued by the differences in the ways that your particular translation deals with some of this from the one that I read. And I'm not going to read all of this. Chapter 2 starts the section of Daniel that is written in Aramaic. Aramaic was to use a much later expression, the lingua franca, the language that everybody spoke in the ancient Mesopotamia and Near East, all around the far eastern Mediterranean, and then down in the land between the rivers. So they're speaking in Aramaic, and these stories are all in Aramaic, which points to a root for the stories that's outside strictly of some Jewish traditions. And they all take place in Babylon, and that's worth remembering too. Nebuchadnezzar has a dream, and it says his heart pounded and his sleep was ruined. And so he calls together all the soothsayers, the wizards, the magicians, and the Chaldeans. As if you remember last week, we talked about this, or the Chaldeans. The Chaldeans and the Babylonian culture placed a great emphasis on magic and soothsaying. And so he calls together all the wise men. And he says to them, I've dreamed a dream and my heart pounded. Okay, so what do we know about a dream that somebody's dreamed where their heart is pounding and it wakes them up?
It's a nightmare.
It's pretty scary, right?
Yeah.
And, if you've had one of those dreams, it doesn't have to be absolutely a nightmare. You can wake up and say, there's something really important there that that my mind is working on. Or Daniel would say that this is something the Lord has sent you to think about and work on. There's something going on here that you need to pay attention to. So he brings them all together, and he says, okay, I've decided that what I'm going to do. This matter has been determined by me. If you do not explain to me the dream and its meaning, you will be cut to pieces and your houses turned into dung heaps. Okay. But if you tell me the dream and its meaning, gifts and presents and great honor you shall receive from me. Therefore, tell me the dream and its meaning. So if you're a Babylonian wise man standing in front of the king, what are you going to do?
Fire up the camel, get the heck out of town.
Well, yes, except the king has you all standing right there in front of him, so you can't possibly leave. The guards are at the door. What are you going to do?
You're gonna do some
Make
fast
it up.
talking. Yeah, you're gonna.
Well, except he said, you have to tell me what my dream is. Okay. You have to tell me what I dreamed, and then you have to explain it to me.
Well, it sounds like what they were able to do is to find a disposable labor source and put him between them and the king.
Well, maybe so. Let's listen to the story. So they said to him, okay, let the king say the dream to his servants, and then we shall tell its meaning. Okay, so, come on, king, you got to tell us what the dream was before we can interpret it for you. And the king says to them, indeed, I know that you are buying time. That's literally what it says. That's not a modern way of interpreting it. It literally says in Aramaic, you are buying time because you have seen that the matter was determined by me, meaning I'm not going to change my mind.
Right.
For if you do not explain the dream to me, there is but one decree for you, and you have prepared a false and lying word to say to me until the time passes. So you're just trying to get by here without doing what I ask you to do. And they answer quite fairly. There is no man on earth who can tell the word of the king, because no great or powerful king has ever asked this sort of thing of any soothsayer or wizard or Chaldean. Nobody has ever asked anybody to tell them their dream before they tell them the interpretation. And because of this, the king raged and was very angry and thought.
The way around the interpretation before the dream.
Right.
Yeah.
No, they have to tell them the dream and then tell him the interpretation.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
Okay. Because of this, the king raged and was very angry and thought to put to death all the sages of Babylonia. And a decree was issued that the sages were to be killed, and Daniel and his friends were to be killed. Then Daniel did respond with counsel and insight to Arioch, the chief of the king's executioners, who had gone out to call the sages of Babylon. He spoke and said to Arioch, the king's regent. So they've got two different titles here, but I don't think it particularly matters. And he said, for what is this severe decree from the king? And then Arioch informed Daniel of the matter, and Daniel went and asked of the king that time be given to him to tell the meaning to the king. And then Daniel went to his house and informed Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, his friends, of the matter, to ask mercy from the God of heaven about this mystery, that Daniel and his friends not perish with the rest of the sages of Babylonia. And this was the mystery revealed to Daniel in a night vision. Okay. Then Daniel blessed the God of heavens, and Daniel spoke out and said, and I'm going to stop there because I want to talk a little bit about this. There are a couple of things about this chapter. In chapter 1, it says that this story begins in the 3rd year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, and that the 3 young men were selected to be educated in the ways of the Chaldeans, and that education would take 3 years. In this chapter, it begins in the 2nd year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign. Okay, which can't be given the chronology of the story. But again, this is an indication that this story was something separate and these stories were all brought together. And it didn't, the time doesn't actually matter. There's been a lot of ink spilled in commentaries about how you get from the third year to the second year and still have progressed 6 years. It was a waste of ink, in all honesty. It's not the kind of thing that the story wants you to focus on. But these markers of what year of someone's reign it is simply to give you that sense of reality, that sense that this could have happened, but not to pin down a particular time. Okay. So the kings have got, or the king has got everybody over a barrel. Daniel goes back, he involves his 3 friends, and then they pray about it, and Daniel goes to sleep. And Daniel receives an understanding of what the dream was and its interpretation. And then this next part is actually, well, it's a whole lot of things, but it's like a psalm. It's what it's called a barakat prayer, meaning it's about praising God and stating who God is. And listen to what Daniel says God is. May the name of God be blessed forever and forever, for wisdom and strength are his. He changes the times and the seasons, takes kings away and raises up kings, gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who know discernment. He lays bare the deep and hidden things, knows what is in darkness, and light dwells with him. To you, God of my fathers, I give thanks and praise that you have granted me wisdom and strength, and now you have made known to me that which we asked of you for the matter of the king you have made known to us. Okay, if you're living in Judea in a time when the people are being oppressed by Antiochus Epiphanes, okay, which is 400 years later than this story is supposed to have happened, what does that psalm, that song of praise, that prayer tell you about God?
Well, it tells you what you need to hear.
How so, Bobby?
It strengthens your faith.
Uh-huh.
To hear that said.
Why would it strengthen your faith?
Well, for one thing, you're probably not hearing a lot of that type of talk generally, since you're under oppression. And so to hear the truth feels true, and it increases your faith.
Yes, absolutely. Anybody else?
I think it's maybe something you referred to the last time. It's a reference to that, we've been here before, and we've been here when God was with us before, and he was powerful before, take heart.
Right. So here's what he says of God. Wisdom and strength belong to God. God changes the times and the seasons. God takes away kings and raises up kings. God gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who know discernment. God lays bare the deep and hidden things, knows what is in darkness, and light dwells in him. Okay, so what does that say to you when you're living under a king who says, I'm God?
Well, you know that God is truly the one in control.
Exactly.
And he's the one who's going to show you the way to go.
Exactly. And that's the point of this whole chapter. And can be argued it's the point of all of Daniel.
And also at the very end of that prayer, it's basically saying that despite the fact that God's in control of all this, he's still listening to your prayers too.
Yes, thank you, Chrissy. Hooray, hooray. Because that's going to be a big difference between what the Chaldeans and Nebuchadnezzar say about their gods, or have said about their gods, and what the Jews were saying. And there are no others. It says in verse 11, okay? The Chaldeans say to him, there are no others that can tell it before the king except the gods, whose dwelling is not with the flesh. Okay, so they've already said, the gods don't dwell with us, the gods aren't involved with us, and they're not going to tell us what this means. And the God of Israel, the one who puts kings up and takes kings down, the one who controls the seasons, that God is so intimately involved with us that he told Daniel the meaning of the dream. He gave Daniel of his wisdom and strength to have the dream. So for people oppressed or people struggling with assimilation, because remember, chapter 1 is all about how much do you actually assimilate into the culture and how much do you keep your identity different? How much does your faithfulness to God matter more than having all your neighbors like you? So this little prayer of praise, which is what Barakah means, is praise, this explains the whole premise, both of the chapter before and the chapter after. Comments, questions? Okay. So because of this vision, Daniel goes to Arioch, whom the king had appointed to put to death all the sages of Babylonia. And he went, and thus he said to him, do not put to death the sages of Babylonia. Bring me before the king, and I will tell the meaning to the king. Okay, so Arioch is going to buy it just on Daniel saying, which is a little gap in the story. You know, if this were a mystery or some sort of thriller novel, the critics would all have gone back and said, well, there's a big gap here. You know, this is like all magically happening, okay? So thus did Arioch rush to bring Daniel before the king, and thus he said to him, there is a man from the exiles from Judah who will explain the meaning to the king. Okay, a little earlier it said that Daniel went to the king himself. I don't think this is the kind of thing you want to split hairs over. And here it says that Arioch went and told him who Daniel was, and then he let Daniel in. What it does say here is the king answered and said to Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar. Say it for me.
Belteshazzar.
Thank you. I can't get it out tonight. Okay, that's actually a name that dedicates him to Marduk, who is the god of the Babylonians. Okay, remember they changed their names to change their identity within the people. So Belteshazzar, it becomes the name that Daniel needs to use in front of Nebuchadnezzar. He doesn't want to use the name Daniel, which implies that he's in fact dedicated to the God of Israel. You know, God is my strength, is what Daniel means. And the king says, can you explain to me the dream I saw and the meaning? And Daniel is a master at flattery. The mystery of which the king has asked sages and wizards and soothsayers and diviners, they cannot tell the king, but there is a God in the heavens who reveals mysteries and has made known to the king what will be in latter days, your dreams and your visions in your head as you lay asleep. That is it. Your king, your thought, you king, your thought has risen as you lay asleep of what will come in the time, or what will be in the time to come, and the revealer of mysteries, that's God, has made known to you what will be. And he goes, as for me, I have no more right to that than you do, but it has been revealed to me in order to make known to the king the meaning, that you may know what your heart was thinking. Okay, and especially in the middle, or in the ancient world, the heart was not just an organ that pumped blood. The heart was and not everything happened between your ears. Okay. Your true understanding happened in your heart. And your true concern for the world. So that's not, to have it happen in your heart is not strictly emotional. It's about comprehension. It's about what your heart is really involved in and worried about. Okay. You, king, were seeing, and look, there was a huge statue, and the statue was great, and its brilliance was abundant. It was standing before you, and its appearance was fearsome. That statue, its head was goodly gold, its chest and arms were silver, its loins and its thighs were bronze, its legs were iron, and its feet part iron and part clay. And you were watching till a stone hewed not by hands struck the statue on its feet of iron and clay and shattered them. Okay, now, one of the issues with iron that, in this particular image, and we'll talk about it more later, is iron was always considered the implement of, or the makings for implements of war. And the Israelites lost numerous battles to the Hittites and to the Babylonians and to others because they were still a Bronze Age people when other peoples around them had figured out how to make implements of war out of iron. And if you've ever tried running anything bronze into iron, you'll find out it doesn't work very well. So iron is definitely oppressive in all of these images of the different metals. The other thing is the metals go down in value from gold to silver to bronze to iron. And then, as you know, iron and clay do not mix. You can't form a stable substance out of the two of them. So the stone, it was a stone hewed not by hands. It struck the statue on its feet of iron and clay and shattered them, and became like chaff before the summer threshing floor, and no place was found for them. So it was all blown away. It became like dust, the whole statue, when it was hit by this stone. And the stone that struck the statue became a great mountain and filled all the earth. This is its dream, and its meaning we shall say before the king. You are king, even king of kings, to whom the God of heavens has given power and might and honor. And wherever human beasts, beasts of the field, and fowl of heavens live, he has given them into your hands and caused you to rule over them all. You are the head of gold. Okay. Daniel tells Nebuchadnezzar that wherever human beasts, beasts of the field, and fowl of the heavens live, he has given them in your hand and caused you to rule over them all. Now, if you're Nebuchadnezzar, how are you going to hear that sentence? You're going to hear it as in you rule the whole world. And you're powerful enough to rule the whole world. If you're a faithful Jew, how are you going to hear that sentence?
God's in control.
Thank you, Jack. Yes, exactly. God did this. You didn't do it on your own power.
Yeah.
My previous comment was bad to the bone, is what you're thinking if you're that guy with a golden head.
Well,
Bad to the bone.
You're not what you think you are, is certainly the case. You are
Yes, that too.
Yeah, you are the head of gold, and after you shall arise another kingdom inferior to yours, and then a third kingdom of bronze that shall rule over all the earth, and a fourth kingdom shall be strong as iron, because iron shatters and splinters all things, and like smashing iron, all these shall it shatter and smash. And as to the feet and the toes you saw, part potter's clay and part iron, the kingdom shall be split, and it shall have the strength of iron, because you saw iron mixed with the clay of the soil. And as to the toes, part iron and part clay, some of the kingdom shall be strong, and some of it fragile. And as to your seeing iron mixed with clay from the soil, these shall be mixed with human seed, and they shall not hold together, just as iron does not mix with clay. I've got some coffee here. So we have Nebuchadnezzar as the kingdom of gold. Most probably, the kingdom of the Persians and the Medes was the kingdom of silver. They are the kingdom that conquers Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom or the kingdom of Babylon in a couple of generations. Excuse me. They're the silver and then the bronze. The iron is Greece, and it's Alexander's kingdom. Alexander was, as you know, had conquered all of the known world and then some before his death at the ripe old age of 34. But when he died, the kingdom was split into 3 portions. And when the kingdom was split, or the empire was split into 3 portions, none of them were stable. And that was especially true of the Seleucid kingdom that ruled Palestine, and the Ptolemaic kingdom, or the Ptolemies, that ruled Egypt. And they intermarried, which is the whole business of clay and iron being mixed with human seed. Okay. The stone that's uncut by human hands is the kingdom of God. It's what God will bring. It's not an asteroid. I've seen that explanation today. There are a lot of explanations for this that make me want to jump up and down. That's one of them. It's not some asteroid that's going to come and strike the earth and destroy everything. This is a visual interpretation of the fact that no kingdom can stand before God. It is the might and power of God that rules all things. Questions, comments? Okay. So here you go. This is a later interpretation. To see it this way is wrong on all sorts of levels. Certainly in the early Christian world, the first 4 of these categories, I can't cross the bottom one out, just pretend it's not there. So you have Babylon in the Golden Age. You have the Silver Age of the Medians and Persians. You have the Bronze Age of the Greek Macedonian Empire. And then the Roman Empire becomes the beast, or becomes the Iron Age at the bottom. Ignore the black box for right now. So that in early Christian writing, you see those 4 kingdoms broken down this way. Here's the problem. If those 4 kingdoms were actually the way it was intended to be read, Daniel was written before the Roman Empire ever existed or could have been imagined. So that would have meant that the people who were reading Daniel at the time of the oppression by the Seleucids and Antiochus Epiphanes would have had no idea what he was talking about. And prophecy isn't very good for anybody if people don't have any idea what it's talking about. And it certainly wouldn't have meant anything to Nebuchadnezzar. Okay. But it does mean, but when you see the sentences here about they shall be mixed with human seed and shall not hold together as iron does not mix with clay, the Seleucids and the Ptolemies never formed stable kingdoms. Cleopatra was the last of the Ptolemaic pharaohs, but their entire history over a period of 300 and some years was really unstable. It never worked well. And that would have been the reality that we know. Lots of contemporary dispensationalist interpretation then offered the last box. The feet of clay and iron are the modern age that begins with the Holy Roman Empire, is what they usually say, the new Roman Empire, but it often says the Holy Roman Empire. There's 10 kings and kingdoms. There's the European Union. There's the New World Order. There's all sorts of conspiracy nonsense that goes in this. The UN is often listed at the bottom here. All sorts of things like that. And God's going to send a meteor, in this case, the second coming of Christ, and it's going to destroy the earth. Neither Daniel nor Revelation ever preached the destruction of the earth. Okay. If you read Daniel in a way that harmonizes the visions of the dream of chapter 2 with the visions of chapter 12, that's where you get the lion and the bear and the leopard and the beast. Okay. But Daniel only has 4 beasts. He doesn't have a 5th beast for that new one. So there's a problem there. You're forcing all the meaning into a future that the readers of Daniel couldn't possibly have imagined. And there's a gap of 1,400 years between the Roman Empire and the new Roman Empire of divided Roman states. Now, what happened in that 1,400 years apparently wasn't important, and especially what happened. The other thing about this that's so pernicious is it does not care what happened in Asia or in India or in any other parts of the world. It's completely European-centric, and it understands the whole salvation of the world to be involved in Europe and Europeans or North Americans.
Well, finally.
Finally, yeah. When God finally brings it, it's going to be. So it's okay. I don't want to start jumping up and down, but I'm going to ask you if you've got questions or comments.
Can take it down.
I'll stop sharing so we can see each other.
It just seems amazingly irresponsible to leap to these conclusions with such kind of dramatic consequences, especially if you're using it. Is that a way to align your life, right? I mean, goodness gracious.
Yeah,
but it's a good way to read, sell a book.
Yeah.
Well, there's that.
There's that whole Left Behind series. If you even skimmed the plots, all the bad guys were Eastern Europeans. All the good guys were North Americans or Northwestern Europeans, okay? There weren't any in between, and all the other peoples of the world were irrelevant. And anytime somebody's going to give you a dispensation of world history that breaks it down like that and says, there's nothing about Chinese history, there's nothing about Indian history, there's nothing about African history, there's nothing about anybody else's history, but that's important to God except ours.
That's a conceit.
That's such a nice way of putting it.
Well, we're in public. I have another term, but you know, bovine scatology also comes to mind.
Yeah. It was. Thank you.
I was thinking about our Sunday discussion.
Yeah. It's incredibly narrow, and it's ahistorical in all the kinds of ways that is that people deserve their criticism or deserve to be criticized for. It's truly awful. I didn't copy it the first time. There was one of those statues that had a little American flag coming out of the toes, as well as the European Union flag and the UN flag and some things like that. So that was an exceptionally bad one. And I threw a temper tantrum.
Don't go there. Don't go there.
Yeah, I threw a temper tantrum and lost it. So anyway, and so, but he says, in these days of these kings, we'll go back to Daniel here, the God of the heavens shall establish a kingdom that shall never be destroyed. To another people it shall not be abandoned. It shall shatter and put an end to all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. Okay, God's kingdom, it never uses that phrase, but the kingdom of God will stand on top of, literally, this mountain is going to grow over all of these kingdoms, and all of the earth will belong to God. But he hasn't said that to Nebuchadnezzar. What he said is, you have seen from that a mountain of stone that was hewed not by hands, it smashed iron, bronze, clay, silver, and gold. And the great God has made known to the king what will be after this, and the dream is true, its meaning certain. And then Nebuchadnezzar does something very interesting. He falls on his face and bows down to Daniel, and he said, meaning he told others to offer him grain and incense. If you're Jewish, do you ever fall down on your face in front of anybody except God? If you're Christian, by the way, do you ever kneel or fall on your face in front of anybody but God? And you don't worship anybody, which is what the grain offerings and the wine offerings are about, or incense offerings. But but the king says to Daniel, clearly not understanding what he says, in truth, your God is the God of gods, the master of kings and the revealer of mysteries, for you were able to reveal this mystery. Then did the king make Daniel great, and he gave him many gifts and caused him to rule over the province of Babylonia, and made him chief governor over all the sages of Babylonia. And Daniel asked of the king, and he appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to work over the work of the province of Babylonia. And Daniel served in the king's gate. Serving in the king's gate means he served in the palace. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are then given sort of governor authority or really upper level bureaucrat. So all three of them go into the upper reaches and councils of the king of Babylon, which is like who?
Joseph.
It's like Joseph. It's also like Mordecai in the story of Esther. Mordecai becomes the king's chief counsel. And so it's a little tougher in Judith, because Judith is braver than all the men in the little town, I've forgotten the name of it, that she lives in. But she actually even becomes the leader of the council of the men in her city after she kills Holofernes. So extraordinary courage is part of this story, and it's a part of the story that ends up with rewards. But those rewards, while they look like they come from the king, they actually come from God. They're a reward for the commitment. And we can go, oh, here we go. If we go here, I think I've got another slide that might be worth it. This is just a summary. The word that the Hebrew uses for mysteries is raza, which means mystery and knowledge. It's not mystery as in some puzzle that can't be solved, but God is this is what God is in this particular chapter, and he's what God is in the whole book. He's the revealer of mysteries and knowledge. He's the ultimate source of wisdom and must help with the comprehension of God's purposes. God's purposes are too deep for us. We cannot know them unless God reveals them to us. So the dream is God's revelation of God's promise or God's purposes, but only with God's help can the dream be interpreted. Divine knowledge in Daniel is needed to solve human problems. Okay, and the only way, and we'll get to this on the next slide too, the only way to get to divine knowledge is to pray, to bring your whole self before God. God is sovereign over all things. That's that whole Barakat prayer that we read. Okay, even time, much less a king. God's intimately connected to a human community. And before God, even the spiritual resources of the greatest rulers are helpless. They cannot tell you what God's purpose is. They cannot solve the mysteries that God has in store. Okay. For us, what can Daniel 2 say to us? That faithful waiting involves faithfulness to God and God's laws. That effective leadership when you're being persecuted requires involvement of your colleagues in the pursuit of justice. Notice Daniel doesn't go out here on his own. He goes back and gets Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who are called by their Hebrew names in this story. And he says, okay, you guys have got to pray with me. We got to do this all together. We've got to ask for God's mercy. Otherwise, we're all dead men. So let's see what we can do here. Life under tyrants should always show concern for other individuals in the community. Daniel goes back and he says, don't kill all the sages. Let me pray about it. Let me come to you tomorrow at 2:00 in the afternoon and we'll get this all squared away. It requires faithful waiting in the context of prayer and occasionally requires acts of exceptional courage. God may ask of you that which, or the situation which puts your life at risk. And lastly, that God is the source of all wisdom and power. So that's the end of chapter 2. Comments, questions, things we want to talk about before we spend a few minutes on chapter 3. Okay, well, then we'll go to chapter 3 at this point. Chapter 3 is the story that we always tell children. I do not know why we tell this story to children. It is not really a child-friendly story. Worse, we often title the story "The Hebrew Children in the Fiery Furnace" and show the children in the furnace being 12-year-old boys or so. These are Sunday school lessons I found online. Don't ask me why. They are not children. They're adults, okay? They're young men. And why would you show children in Sunday school a picture of 12-year-olds in a fire?
So they'll behave better at VBS.
There's one. That's one, Chrissy. But it's bizarre. I mean, the pictures that we see for this are really bizarre. But at any rate, so there's Mike Fraley asked Paul Woolley and Ashley about the story about the bears and the children. That's actually a gross misinterpretation of the text, but we tell them that story too, and I don't understand it. So the next story is the story of
Sorry.
Oh, yeah, there we go. There's one of them. So
just for your edification.
The next story is the story of the young men in the fiery furnace, and it's one that almost everybody knows and almost nobody knows. Again, like the story we just went through, it has a lot to say to us about who God is and what's really going on. I showed you this image before when we were doing Christian art before Christmas. This is one of the oldest paintings in the catacombs in Rome. This is the three young men. They're dressed in what was perceived to be Persian dress in the Roman Empire. They have these little Roman hats on that are like turbans with top knots on them. And here is the fourth figure that the story says was a man, but here is depicted as the Holy Spirit. This was a really popular story in early Christian art, one of the most popular. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. It has to do with some peculiarly Christian understandings of the language in the story that may or may not be necessary to telling the truth of the story. We'll get there. Maybe not tonight, but next week if we don't get there tonight. Here's one depiction of the statue that Nebuchadnezzar might have done. Given the measurements, it was about 80 feet tall and 8 feet wide. It probably wouldn't actually have stood up, at least not without structural steel, which they didn't have. But this was one of the only images I could find that made any sense at all. And it was on a whole teacher site from Minecraft, where you can learn all this. Actually, their history about Nebuchadnezzar was really very good. But yeah, I can't see Alan
celebrating,
but I'm sure Alan is celebrating. I knew he would. That's why I put the credit down there. But Minecraft has a whole site for teachers where you can do history and discover other things, and that's where this came from. So I thought that those of you who are big-time gamers in the audience would enjoy that. But it says, when you hear the sound of the horn, the pipe, the zither, the dulcimer, the harp, the double flute, and all the other musical instruments, you must fall down and worship the golden statue which the king Nebuchadnezzar has set up. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be instantly thrown into, I missed a part, thrown into the fiery furnace that we already have hot and ready for you here. Which it doesn't say, but that's kind of where it goes. I want to say a little bit about this story. It's a very different, in some ways, literarily, it's a little bit different story. But one of the things that, and this is what started our fairy tale and court's tale talk this afternoon. One of the things about this story is that it likes lists. Okay, so it says at the beginning in chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar sent out to assemble the satraps, the governors, the officials, the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the commanders of the camps, and all the administrators of the provinces. And he uses that list multiple times here. It's a court tale thing to use a list like that multiple times, not necessarily on that topic, but in Esther, the king does the same thing. He sends it out, and there's this long list of people to whom it's sent, including the governors, the ministers of the provinces from India to Kush, 127 provinces, every province according to its own mode of writing, and every people according to its language, and to the Jews. Okay, so it goes on and on. But what happens, can you think of a story you might have told young children at some point or another that does that same sort of thing, that has something that you can repeat every time that's like that has its own rhythm?
Like the house that Jack built?
Yeah, there's a good one. Uh-huh.
Yeah. Or the Three Little Pigs.
I'll huff and I'll puff and I'll blow your house down, right? Or the
Not by the hair of my chinny chin chin.
Or the Three Billy Goats Gruff, when he says, "Who's that trip trapping over my bridge?" Okay, it's always the same language, and this is a mark of oral stories, that you use this kind of language to help people remember it. So not only is chapter 3 saying that Nebuchadnezzar sent this out to all of the empire, but imagine you're an 8-year-old kid and you've heard this story about 5 or 6 times, and you can already say, and he assembled the satraps and the governors and the officials and the counselors and the treasurers and the judges and the commanders of the camps and all the administrators of the provinces. You'll be able to sing it right along with whoever's telling the story. And so the story works that way. It's the same way with all of the lyres and the flutes and all kinds of music, okay? It repeats that over and over, and it's a way of cementing in your mind what's going on in the story. So Nebuchadnezzar builds his statue. He calls everybody together to come and worship, and they're going to fall down in front of his statue. Okay. The same thing happens in Esther when the Jews refuse to kneel before the king. Okay. And Haman sets up Mordecai and all the Jews to die because they will not prostrate themselves before the king. Okay. So a bunch of the Chaldeans who, even if this were a chronological story, they would definitely have a bone to pick because Daniel showed them all up when he interpreted the dream, right? They come to Nebuchadnezzar and they say, "O king, may you live forever. You, O king, put out a decree that any man who heard the sound of the horn, the pipe, the lyre, must fall down and worship the golden statue. And whoever did not fall down would be cast into the furnace of blazing fire." Well, there are certain Jewish men that you've appointed over all the work of the province of Babylonia, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and they have paid no heed to you, O king. They do not serve your God, and they do not worship the golden statue that you set up. Now, somewhere along the line, I think in the Paul class, but I can't remember where, we talked about what an image meant, what a statue would mean in terms of its presence in a public place. And I don't know, does anybody remember what we talked about, what we said about those statues, what it meant to be an image? Okay. The statues, we tend to regard them as 3D representations of somebody else's body. But in the ancient world, the statues were emblematic of the authority of the king. They carried some of that authority and cachet with them. And so to worship the statue was in a sense to also worship the king, to offer your subservience, because there was something more real about that statue than we would think it is. It's a fundamental kind of understanding in understanding human beings as bearing the image of God. And it's really hard for us to unpack because as post-Enlightenment Christians, and especially for Protestant Christians who are now used to not only statues being torn down or put up depending on our whim, but also photographs, which we don't regard as true images in one sense. It's hard for us to understand the living connection that comes between a statue or an image of the ruler and worship. But that's definitely playing a part of this. So Nebuchadnezzar gets very angry, and he says to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego into his presence. And he says, "Is it true that you are not serving my God and not worshiping the golden statue I put up?" And then he goes, "Now, if you're ready," and he goes through that whole long list of instruments again, and you hear music of all kinds, and you worship the statue I've made, everything's going to be just fine. But if you do not worship, you will be at once thrown into the furnace of blazing fire. And they said, "We do not need to answer you about this matter. If our God, whom we serve, is able to save us from the furnace of blazing fire and from your hand, O king, he shall save us. And if not, let it be known to you, O king, that we will not serve your God, and we will not worship the gold statue that you have set up. Okay, couple of things. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are not well-developed characters here. They don't have, they're not intended to be anything other than symbols of what it would be to be faithful young men in the presence of a society that is pushing them to assimilate in every way possible. The other thing is they don't know the outcome.
No,
they say, if God can and will do it, God can and will do it. And if he can, it doesn't matter. We're not going to worship a false god.
And that's a repeated refrain in the Old Testament, which I think gets kind of lost in contemporary conversations about prayer and faithfulness. You get people who will say, well, what's prayer good for if you can't get the answer you want? Or what is obedience or faithfulness good for if you don't get a good result? But here and elsewhere in the Old and New Testament, think Job, good things don't always happen to good people. Be faithful anyway. Think Jesus, let this cup pass from me, but if not, thy will be done. Think Paul, whether in good times or bad, I rejoice in Christ. The Old Testament and New Testament lessons are very different. They're lessons of endurance and faithfulness.
And
Come
trust.
what may.
And trust.
Yeah.
And so we'll leave it on this sentence. Then was Nebuchadnezzar filled with wrath, and the look of his face changed because of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Which is a nice little detail and a great place to end. Any other questions or comments before we go?
I just want to point out to Mike that I think that the Patriots probably could be put into the end times here with the rise of Brady. There's something. Why can't we put that in here too? That seems to work for me. You could probably shoehorn that in and make it work.
You and I need to have a talk because there was like local mourning as our regional deity had departed. I'm not.
Well, and Paul, who's not to say that what's really a sign of the end times is that Tampa Bay is in the Super Bowl.
Right. Dan Shaughnessy said that the clown car show down in Tampa. How did they? Only Brady could make it work. Anyway, sorry, I digress.
Nice, Paul.
So,
at least you weren't awkward.
Okay, we might even get through the rest of 3 and chapter 4 next week. So we'll see.
It's really good to see all of you.
It's great to see you guys.
You too.
I hope you're having fun. I'm having great fun with this. I like it. I think
really
it's
enjoyable.
Very much so.
Not something we talk about. So
thanks for spending the time with us. We really benefit from your questions and comments.
Thank you. Good night.
Great. Blessings. Good night, all.
Good night.
Blessings. And thank you.
Thanks.